Well, I don't mind relaying them. I, you want to show them to me, that's fine. But I'm going to be like, so it's okay. Okay, yeah, Pine Creek being the first in the comment section on Doug's channel. Yeah, I was on. I did talk to Doug years ago. Yeah, well, not years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, nice guy. Sure. You maybe mute my mic.
This episode of the TJump podcast is brought to you by you. If you value this content, please consider supporting the channel.
Absolutely. I am a staff apologist at Watchman Fellowship in Arlington, Texas. I am the executive producer of two of our podcasts. You can find them on iTunes and Patreon. One is a podcast about cosmology and Christianity and creation called Good Heavens. So you can find that at patreon.com/goodheavens. And we also produce another podcast, patreon.com/Watchman Fellowship, called the Apologetics Profile Podcast. And we talk about other religions, apologetics topics, worldviews, and things like that. And we produce that once a week. Good Heavens is about 2 to 3 times a month. But I do that. I've been a Christian for 27 years. I am a co-editor of this book, The Story of the Cosmos, How the Heavens Declare the Glory of God, with philosopher Paul Gould. And that came out in July of last year. It's my first book. I have an essay in the beginning. And I have a degree in cultural apologetics from Houston Baptist University. And I did my thesis under the direction of Oxford scholar Dr. Michael Ward on C.S. Lewis and his imagination in the cosmos. And I struggled with depression, lost my father to suicide when I was in high school. And I have 3 younger brothers, never been married. I love to stargaze. Sure, sure, sure. Briefly, as I said, I'm an adult convert, so I came to Christ. Christ came to me about 27 years ago. And I had no religious upbringing. And in my early 20s, I had 2 convictions kind of come to me rather subtly, like a sunrise. Really, one was that Jesus was real, kind of a weird thing. Um, okay, and the other one was that the Bible was the Word of God. I had no formal uh, indoctrination in Scripture. I didn't know anything about Scripture. I thought Christians were nice, but were a little strange. I didn't know anything about Jesus. I mean, I still think Christians are nice and strange. I'm one of them now. But really, Tom, over the course of about 6 months back in 1992 and 93, these 2 convictions would not. I couldn't. I had to process through them. I don't quite know how they happened really. So I started reading the Bible, and I keep a journal. I've been keeping a journal for 27 years. I write in it. I read Scripture, and I write in my journal how I think God is speaking to me. And then through about 6 months of that, I was baptized in 1993. And then I didn't know squat about Christianity. Even when I got dunked, I probably knew nothing about it. I didn't know anything about apologetics. I barely understood what Jesus had done for me. And I think I was ignorant of a great many things. So it's kind of weird. I started my Christian faith that way. And then I have, over the course of the last 27 years, developed reasons for, better understanding my faith. As St. Augustine said, I want to believe in order to know. And that's kind of what my experience has been. I started with this belief or conviction that Jesus is real, he's the Lord, he's God, and worked that out. What does that mean? If that's true, what's it look like? What should I do? And so the last 27 years have been that process of what theologians call sanctification, being made more and more like Christ, in the image of Christ as I grow in the knowledge of him. So my reasons for believing were those two convictions. That's what started me.
And then you said you found more reasons as you got older, or you researched more into
Yes.
it?
Yeah. So completely ignorant of the Christian faith. I think even after I was baptized, I didn't even know what the Bible really was all about. I didn't know the distinction between sin and grace in the Old and New Testaments. And, I just kind of thought that everything from Genesis to Revelation, like if you're a Christian, you have to do everything in that. But then when I get to like Leviticus, like, what do I do with that? Or Proverbs. One of the things that really started me down the road of investigating this, Tom, was reading the book of Proverbs as a baby Christian. And I'm thinking, as I'm reading Proverbs, I feel like the book of Proverbs, I feel more like the fool in Proverbs than I do the wise person. And I just didn't know what to do with that. I thought all Christians were obviously the wise person in Proverbs, and that here I was, a new Christian, already feeling like, well, I'm not getting this. And what I started to experience, and I didn't know then, was the distinction about the law, the whole theological concept of law versus grace, that we all fall short of the glory of God, which is the law, which is what God gave to Moses. So I started this idea, this concept of the Bible started reading me. I really started feeling foolish and inadequate. And then over the course of years, I began to realize and understand. I went to seminary for a year. I got two degrees, and just how what I would call epistemic humility, Jesus developing in me this sense of epistemic humility. And what I mean by that is just being cognizant of my own sinful nature in need of Christ. Just sort of, I wanted to know. I wanted to be able to give a defense, as 1 Peter 3:15 says. But I wanted to know, but yet, a lot of that knowledge puffs up. I've been a very judgmental, egotistical person at times in my Christian faith. But as God has revealed himself more and more to me over time, I feel like the older I get and the more I know, the less I actually know. So over time and experience, through hardship and suffering, and through the forge of depression, God has even taught me how to rely on him and to give a soft answer, and to share people why I believe.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't see any problem with that so far. It's mostly just personal experience, and I definitely agree with you that as we get older, we realize more about what we don't know. The more we know, the more we realize we don't know. The Dunning-Kruger kind of a
Yeah,
thing. But
yeah.
yeah, I totally agree there. But how did that, or what is there any evidence or arguments that actually lead you to the belief of a God, or was it just your experience or your feelings that got you there?
Well, whether I call it a feeling or a belief, when I was 25 and had a girlfriend and life was going pretty well, um, why these two convictions about Jesus and the Bible? I still really can't explain them other than God approaching me through his spirit, through his son. Like, come here, son, I have something for you. In that sense, some people have said, well, it's because your father died that you wanted to cling to a father figure. No, I've had problems with father figures and authority figures all of my life because of my father in that situation. I was not looking for God at 24 years old. I was not pining for a father. I needed one more than I wanted one. Let's just say that. And so God sort of took the role of father, and shortly after I became a Christian. So yeah, I mean, I'm not grounding my faith. I'm not saying it's true because I've had this personal experience. It's true independently of me or not, whether or not my experience attests to it. But I think in living out a sort of proof, if you will, living it out, you begin to see um, the truth of it unfold before you. So I'm not using my personal, I mean, I have my personal experience. That is one thing that I do have. But I wouldn't say that because of my personal experience, it must be true. But that's just describing how it began, and that conviction of how it's lasted through the last 27 years of talking to atheists, learning about science, learning about the cosmos, learning about history and philosophy and all that stuff, and learning, okay, if the Christian faith is true, how does it inform other aspects of our society, which is a very modernistic, anti-agrarian society. I was just talking to a theologian in Scotland, interviewed him about his book, and we talked about one thing, like the loss of kingship in our cultures. as you know, Tom, that in the UK, the Queen is just sort of like a figurehead. Not She didn't have the authority of what she once did. So and in the United States, how did we start off? We started off with to heck with you, King, right? We just no more. So we have a problem right off the bat culturally of trying to imagine Jesus or God as a king. That's problematic. The other problem is that we are not an agrarian society anymore. We can go to the grocery store at any time of year, any time of day, and get an apple if we want to, or a grapefruit, or a banana. We've lost the sense of what it means to be to know the world through the eyes of a farmer. Jesus uses so many parables of agrarian in agrarian nature, like seeds and planting and harvesting, and that's just something that's lost to us. So we're at a disadvantage culturally. We swim in a very modernistic scientific worldview that it's difficult to put our feet, our faith, our understanding in a culture that was very accustomed to monarchy and to an agrarian way of life. And so the modern world is very, in its presuppositions, is very anti-Christ, I would say. And so it's a very difficult uphill battle to try to establish the legitimacy of Christ, the preeminency of Jesus in this world that hates him.
I mean, I probably would agree with that. I think I'm not a big fan of Jesus, or especially the Old Testament. In many ways, I think it's wrong about most things. It doesn't seem to be to map onto society or morality very well. And the more important things, I don't see any reason to believe it's true. I mean, it just seems like a bunch of stories, no different from any other stories that came 2,000 years ago. So why should we believe that any of that's actually true? I mean, I can understand that your personal experience you had, like if I had a similar personal experience where I prayed to God and God did something for me in life and had a powerful impact on me and made my life better in some way, I would absolutely believe for sure. But that didn't happen. And as far as I know, it doesn't happen for most people who aren't already Christian, or for the most part. So do we have any reason to believe that Jesus is actually a God, or that the Old Testament was true in any way other than just the personal experience?
Sure. I mean, a great question, because obviously other people have different experiences, as you say. Some pray and don't get the answer they want, or a Muslim prays or a Mormon prays and they get that burning bosom experience or whatever. So we have people that have a multitude. Not everybody's experience. Everybody's experience is legitimate. I mean, you've had experiences, Tom. I wouldn't deny the legitimacy of those experiences, of course. So do Muslims and Mormons and everybody else. We all have personal experiences, and I don't deny that those are genuine and real and seem very true and apparent to us. I think the question is, what of these personal experiences, which kind best aligns itself with the way the world really is? And so one factor would be, obviously, we start with our personal experience and examine it in light of the way the world seems to be. But the other problem is, Tom, and of course we all suffer from this. I'm not just saying atheists and Christians, but everybody, we all suffer from this. And when we talk about reality, our perception is finite and limited. So we could talk about reality, we could talk about the cosmos and trees and biology and DNA. But in truth, we are epistemically finite in what we can know about reality. And so the thing to do would be to do the one thing, to hold your experience, to hold your experience with an open hand and interpret your experience in light of what you see around you. So kind of what I did, I took my experience of those two convictions and I stepped out in faith, if you will, and tried to live in accordance with what the truth says. But you bring up a good point. I want to talk about it. I don't want to read anything that might offend you. If you don't want me to read scripture, I won't, but I had a reference in scripture that I wanted to refer to based on what you said about silence, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
Okay, because it's how familiar, I'm sure you used to be a Christian, so you're familiar with scripture. I don't want to presume that you don't know anything. I'll assume that you're familiar with the Bible.
Yeah, I've read it cover to cover multiple times. My parents actually paid me to do it once, so.
Ooh, wow, I didn't. That's fantastic. So in Psalm 22, David is crying out in anguish, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry by day, but thou dost not answer, and by night I have no rest. And I'll agree with you, Tom. I mean, there are times when you pray, God doesn't. It seems like you're talking to the carpet fuzz. it seems like you're just talking to an echo chamber. You're just talking to yourself. Maybe you're trying to drum up some sort of wishful thinking. Oh my gosh, I mean, the experiences of the people of the Old Testament who God chooses. I don't think there's a one that hasn't gone through what St. John of the Cross once called the dark night of the soul. That that a believer who generally seeks to follow after God isn't going to at some point be disillusioned with God and God's apparent silence. And of course, I read Psalm 22 because in Matthew 27:46, this is the same cry that Jesus cries from the cross. Why have you forsaken me, God? And so this forsakenness of God, Tom, is a very real and genuine experience that I don't doubt that you had. I have them. I have a book. This is a great book. It's a little book. Spurgeon, Charles Spurgeon, the great evangelist, preacher of the 19th century, struggled terribly with depression and doubt, if you can believe it. But his chapel services were filled every Sunday. I mean, he was a wonderful. I read him devotionally, but he struggled with doubts and depression. God didn't deliver him from depression. God hasn't delivered me from depression. He's delivered me from other things, but not that. He's been silent on that. He's brought me through that. But in that silence, Tom, it's interesting because one thing I've learned, if I'm claiming, me personally, I say, God, you're silent, God, I don't hear you. What am I assuming? I'm assuming that when God speaks, I recognize his voice. And the truth is, Tom, when he does speak, sometimes I don't want to hear it because it goes right here. And so I pretend, maybe sometimes I do this, I pretend I don't hear it because he's not answering my prayers in accordance with the way I've been petitioning him. But maybe his answer is right here and I don't want to hear it. And that's me personally as a Christian. I don't want to pick up my cross. I don't want to deny myself, and so sometimes that silence is genuine. Sometimes you're genuinely forsaken by God. Sometimes God generally does not answer you. But being able to interpret God's silence, I think, is also the flip side of that, is being able to understand when he does and answer prayer or when he does speak. And that's kind of what I've come to the conclusion about. But
Yeah, I would actually agree with you there, but my question would be is like, how do we tell the difference between, like you said, the times when he's forsaken us and silent and the times he actually answers? Because for me, as an atheist perspective, it all seems just like imaginary. This just seems to be like things, psychological pinnings that people are attributing
yeah,
to what happens in the world by pure chance. They happen to feel better, or the placebo effect. You pray to someone who you think is going to help, kind of like talking to
sure.
someone when you're depressed who you think is going to help. And it gives you those feelings. But as far as I can tell, there's nothing that actually gives us a reason to believe those are more than just imaginary, other than just our feelings, which are also imaginary.
Well, and I think it's a good point because you're dealing with the realm of personal experience, and there's certainly in psychology and medicine, as you know, the placebo effect. You just gave me a sugar pill, but wow, I feel great. But the doc's going, that didn't do anything. You're the test group over here that got the placebo, but you're like, woohoo, medicine. I love medicine, but it wasn't. There was a psychological factor there. So here's the thing with sorrow and feeling and emotions. You're familiar with the scripture in Isaiah of Isaiah talking about the Messiah being a man of sorrows and one acquainted with our grief. And then the shortest verse in the Bible, do you know what that is? Do you remember?
Nope.
John 11:35. You know what it said?
Mm-mm.
You know what's going on there? So Jesus wept. That's the shortest verse in the Bible. And do you know why he's weeping there? Do you know what's going on in John 11? He's he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. His sister, his family's there. Jesus loved Lazarus, but the creator of the universe, who has this power to raise people from the dead, is weeping with the family of the one who they just lost. Jesus loved Lazarus. So I think for me, Tom, I think to understand sorrow and sadness is for me the rehabilitating hope that I have is that the God of the universe was intimately acquainted with my sorrow as a man, as someone like me, and intimately acquainted with the sorrows of other people. And that has basically saved me from suicide. It hasn't cured depression, but I went through, I almost did it about 20 years ago. And God's love intervened in that. Now, as we've been talking, that suicide and sorrow and depression are very serious things. About 40,000 people a year in the United States take their own lives. That's enough to fill Wrigley Field, capacity crowd at Wrigley Field. So there's something tragically wrong with the human condition, Tom. I think we would agree that despite all the technological advances in science and medicine, that we are still wrestling with this idea of human sorrow. So what's going on for me is that I give my sorrows to Christ, who has borne them, and I attest. Now, again, this is just personal experience, but it's what I have. I attest to the fact that the Lord of the universe has spared me. He didn't spare my father, and I don't know why, but he has spared me through the hope that has come from his word, and through fellowship, and through trying to live the Christian life, though I don't do it perfectly. It has given me a reason for continued hope when all is silent or dark. And I think if that weren't true, I think I'm not saying that my personal experience makes it true, but I'm saying I don't take medicine for depression. I pray and have other people pray for me, and I read scripture, and I do things that I try to glorify God, and through that I find relief from despair. That seems to transcend emotions, because if it was just emotions, I should have probably gone back and been tempted by suicide again. But there seems to be a fence there that though I can't see it, I know it's there, and it doesn't permit me to go over the edge.
Well, from my perspective, that seems to happen quite a lot in society for lots of different things. There's lots of things people can latch onto that stop them from being suicidal or depressed in some capacity. Like, for example, one is high functioning autism has this condition called a special interest, where they have one thing that means everything in the world to them. And if they have that one thing, they're perfectly fine. They're happy as can be. Nothing bothers them. If they don't have that thing, they're severely depressed, and nothing can change that. So there are other cases where people find hobbies that they really enjoy and that they distract them from life. And then there's a thing in psychology where they say pick up a hobby like pottery or something as a way to distract yourself, and that works in the same way. So that feature of life of having an idea or a hobby or something you can focus on to stop you from being depressed is a well-known thing in psychology that seems to be very emotional. It has the same effect in all kinds of cultures in all kinds of ways. I don't see any way that this indicates that theism is true in any way. It just seems to be like another one of those psychological ploys, exactly the same as all the other ones, to distract yourself from the pain and to feel better in a way. So I don't see any way that differentiates the existence of a God with just any other imaginary thing.
Well, I think you've said it a few times, and I think the key word there is a distraction, if you will. And our life is filled with distractions. I mean, one of the ways in which I do deal with depression, I agree with you. I have a system of means that I do, like I'll call somebody, I'll go exercise, I'll go for a walk, I'll go stargaze, I'll read, I'll do something I enjoy, right? And those do help. I have to exercise regularly to keep whatever it is going. I'm actively proactive about what I do. That includes certain things, and I avoid certain other things that I know that could cause it. But I think if all that it was a distraction, baseball, video games, whatever, the distraction itself, I know that when I was suicidal 20 years ago, I lost part of depression is what they call anhedonia, where you lose
the inability to feel pleasure.
Exactly. And so distractions can temporarily give us pleasure. I will concur with that. And I know that we can fill our lives with a myriad of distractions, Tom. I would agree with you there as well. And I think to some degree, to some limited capacity, the distractions can be helpful. Absolutely. But I think as you say it, and I think I agree with you completely, that the distraction doesn't actually get to the root of what the despair is. It temporarily takes us away from what we're thinking of, but it doesn't deal with the root cause of why am I sad. I mean, I don't know what the reasons were, but a couple of years ago, you remember Anthony Bourdain from
cooking show.
Yeah, he was a great guy. I mean, he went all over the world. He ate great food. He seemed to have a popular channel. He was at the height of his career, it seemed, but then he took his own life in France, and I don't even know if people really know why. I don't know if there was a note or anything, but you have this, he has everything. He has every distraction that you could possibly want, and it was insufficient finally to prevent him from, giving into that tragedy. And as I'm sure you know, there have been many a Christian. I think it was Rick Warren's son, Tony Dungy's son, and a couple of other pastors in the last 2 years take their own lives. What's going on there? What is distraction enough to keep somebody from taking that horrible leap? And of course, my father left our family devastated from what he did. And he had a wife, a dog, 4 sons, a house. What happened? Nobody saw that coming. I didn't see it coming. And so I don't think the distraction itself, Tom, is able to prevent ultimately someone from taking their own life. And I don't think it's sufficient enough, whether it's exercise. Like exercise by itself for me is not going to keep me from killing myself.
I'll interject there for a minute, because from
Sure.
my perspective, like the word distraction was just my choice of word. It wasn't actually relevant to the argument. So every person is individually, what they need is subjective. It can change from person to person, and different people are affected by different things. And so their depression can be cured in different cases in different ways, for each individual. It can change, vary from person to person. For me, it's a gorgeous blonde. That's my cure for depression. And for the people with autism, it's whatever their special interest is. That's their cure for depression. It could be a car. It's just having a nice car could cure you of depression. And there are many cases of these kinds of effects all over the world. There's no like root cause of depression. It's just a mental neurological state. And if you change the neurological state, you just cure depression. And the thing that can cause that for each individual varies. And so it seems to me that the cure for you, or the partial cure, was belief in a God, and that helped you. But again, I don't see any difference between that and every other case of people who have depression finding something that can cure them, or which I call a distraction, from their depression. So again, I don't see anything in your example that could differentiate yours being like a true cure. I think you said something like the root cause of depression, as opposed to theirs, which are not the root cause, because for them, it seems like cars or money or whatever is the root cause, that they don't have that thing, and getting that thing does cure them of depression for the rest of their lives. And that doesn't seem to be an issue. So again, I don't see a difference between your example and their example. It just seems to be that for you, religion was the motivating factor, whereas for them, it's something else.
Well, if I was after a cure, if you will, Christianity would disappoint because it's not cured. It's prevented me from taking my own life, but it hasn't removed the sorrow that accompanies depression, whether it's chemical or spiritual or moral, whatever.
Right. I didn't mean like the cure. The cure word is, again, just like the distraction word. Those don't matter to the argument. The argument is, so you've had some effect. There's some change that's happened because of your belief in religion, and that same change occurs everywhere in society for anything we can imagine: cars, money, sex, power, books, music. Everything can cause that change. So I don't see any difference between your experience and the experience of everyone else as known in psychology, because again, they're all just psychological states that we are pretty familiar with and how they work in the brain.
Well, I would say that a significant difference for me as a believer is, let's say, someone is temporarily cured or permanently cured, or however you want to use that word, because they've come into a fortune or whatever. But we know from having a lot of money or having a lot of cars. We know, though, that these don't finally work. Otherwise, we would direct everybody toward a particular temporal end to cure their sorrows. So I think the difference maybe between us would be that I would say that I would agree with you in the sense that those things can give temporal satisfaction, sufficiently enough to take our minds off of what may have been causing, or what we may have thought has caused our sorrow. Like somebody becoming wealthy may feel like their depression is cured because poverty was causing them despair. So they have money now, but what happens when the money is gone? Or they had a car, but they lost a car. But if they got a car, their depression is cured. Or they were single, and the singleness was causing them despair, and they got married. But we know that, and I would agree with you that these are temporary. And I say distraction, whatever you want to use the word. That they're temporal. And I would say that, of course, I'm not using just this line of argumentation to say that theism is true. To me, there's a collective.
Well, what is the difference there? Because I
Yeah,
agree with
I'm getting
you.
to that. Yeah, I would say that this is just one argument among many, and sort of abduction argument, a collective whole. So this is just one slice of the pie. But for me, in terms of so here's how I see it. This is just how I see it. For me, I know that the root cause of despair is sin. For me, just the nature of what sin is in me and what has happened to the human race. That sin has inevitably, as Blaise Pascal says, and other theologians have said, we are glorious ruins. We're like the Parthenon, where we had a past glory, but now sin entered the world, and we are not ourselves. We fall short of the glory of God. We know there's something wrong with us, whatever that might be. And so the difference for me, Tom, would be that there's two things here theologically, and I think you can follow this. That Jesus comes to take that from us, the impact of sin. So Jesus, God made Jesus to be sin. He who knew no sin became sin for us. So Jesus deals with the root problem of despair on the cross of Calvary. Now, that doesn't mean that you are freed from the physical problems of sin and despair. We all live in a fallen world. We all deal with, you live where you do, and you've seen the riots, and you've seen all the chaos of humanity. Here we are, a super technological society with all this medicine and technology available to us, and we're fighting in the streets among one another. Something is wrong with us that science can't finally solve. So for me, Jesus solves the sin problem. He takes the impact of sin upon himself. That's justification. God makes me right. Jesus makes me right with God.
Well, wait.
But,
So it seems to me that you imagine there is this root cause of depression, and you imagine that Jesus is the solution to this depression. But when we compare Jesus to all of the other things I listed, Jesus works worse or is less effective at curing depression than all of the other things. So, for example, the money thing, we know that if people have up to $50,000 a year, or below $50,000 a year, they have a much higher level of depression, and above $50,000 a year, you have a much lower level of depression. So having money to a certain degree does in fact cure depression permanently, as long as you have it. And just like in your case of if you have a car and you're not depressed and you lose the car, you become depressed. If you have belief in God, you would be not depressed. And if you lose belief in God, you would be depressed. The same thing applies to both. So again, everything you listed there applies to every single one of the examples I gave before. There was no difference other than that you've presented, other than the fact that you believe there is this root cause, which has no evidence as far as I can tell.
well,
and you believe Jesus is the cure to this root cause, which also has no evidence as far as I can tell.
Well, so a couple of things there. One is evidence, which we could get into. Of course, I'm sure you'll want to get into that. But I think the first, clear up a possible misconception that I may have been at fault for portraying here, that I'm not saying that because Jesus delivers us from sin, that the world, the life in which I live in this world is going to be perfectly utopian. I'm not making that claim. If you read Scripture, it's a life of difficulty and suffering. That part of the fundamental hallmark of the Christian faith is perseverance through suffering. So in a world without God, suffering, evil, however you want to coin that, the maladies that beset us, even if you don't acknowledge them as sin or moral culpability, every one of us knows that even if we had the ability to make our own intuitive moral systems, we're going to fall short of that. There's this thing called moral guilt that we all know. Even if I could make a perfect moral stricture for myself, I couldn't follow it. I mean, it's like, okay, my only moral standard for myself is stopping at stop signs. And I set up this moral system. And then, 2 minutes later, I roll through a stop sign on an intersection. How come I can't even obey my own morality, right? So there's this intrinsic sense that I am guilty and accountable, that I can't unburden myself from without God. So,
well, wait, stop there. Wait 1 second. You can do it without God on many different ways. There are like tons of different ways that work equally as well or better than the God. The God only works for some people who have a psychological disposition to prefer that ideology. That's the problem, is that I'm not accusing you of having said that if you believe in God, all your problems will be solved. If that happened, that would be great evidence. That would be phenomenal evidence. But though we don't see that, what we do see is that Jesus works no better than any other thing in the world to have any effect at all. There's no substantial difference between belief in Jesus and belief in the tooth fairy as for what makes you feel better. They all have the exact same demonstrable effect in reality. So there, as far as I can tell, that does not provide a way to show that Jesus is actually real. Or I think Jesus actually existed as a human, but there's no reason to say he was a god or special in any sense. So that's what I'm
Well, I think
asking, is because all the examples you give are exactly the same psychologically as everything else we see in the world.
I think you bring up an interesting term, and I just it's kind of a utilitarian understanding that it's something that quote works. And so when we talk about Jesus, for me, and for Christendom, I'm not just making a subjective arbitrary distinction here. Uh, Utilitarian purposes, pragmatism, has an end. If I say something works, this pen has a utility, right? It's not for flipping hamburgers or making pancakes. It's for writing. So there's a utility to this pen, a maximal utility, we can say. There's a purpose for this pen. And so with Jesus as the Son of God, as God incarnate, he outlines exactly what the purpose of our lives of being created beings in his image is.
Well, I mean, I grant that, but again, when I say work, I'm asking for how do we differentiate it from imaginary? That's what I mean by work. So I understand that Jesus, the Bible has a story that it's constructed, that it says these things, but that doesn't mean anything to me. Harry Potter does the same thing. What I want when I say work is I want a way to differentiate this from being imaginary. You got to have some way to differentiate imagination from reality. And so when I say work, it's like if I say a drug work, you can see its effects will be greater or lesser than the other drugs, parable or whatever. So that's what I'm looking for when I say work, is what way do we have to differentiate the Jesus story as opposed to anything else from being imaginary or reality?
Okay. I think in a nutshell, to address your question very simplistically without a lot of verbiage, would be to say that God invites people, the world, that does not know him, to watch how his people die. And I don't just mean physical
Watch how they
death.
die?
Watch how they die. And I don't just mean like come to their funeral. I mean the kind of, so Jesus in John 17, he's praying that his people, that the people that believe in him would be one, unified in one body, that their love for one another would be exemplified to the world. So I'll give you a very practical example of something that just happened to me. And this is just one example. I'm not saying this is ironclad proof of anything, but I think it answers your question, at least in one sense. So the answer really is, watch how God's people die, to themselves, to the world. Watch how they live, Tom. You have every right to question what I believe if I'm not living in accordance with what I'm telling you. I don't live the Christian faith perfectly. I'm just a guy. But I don't claim to be living the Christian life perfectly. But a year and a half ago, I believe God led me to give a car, my only car, to a family in need. The car needed repairs. I couldn't afford to repair it, and I had met them driving for Lyft. They told me their sob story. They weren't asking for my car. I asked them. I stayed in touch with them, and I told them I'd be happy to give them my car if they had the money to fix it. It could be theirs, and they could take it. Now, I didn't have another car. It didn't make any sense to me, and I lost a few friends over that decision. That was a year and a half ago. 2 weeks ago, I heard from the family after a year and a half, and they didn't have to get a hold of me. I put no strings. There was no strings attached to the bargain. They bought a used car for me. They already had a car picked out, and they wanted to know if I wanted one, if I still needed a car. And I use that as an example to show that's how the body of Christ works. They were Christians. We both trusted that God was doing something. And this is just but one example of how I've seen God over and over work through practical means. When I step out in faith to do something, yes, faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. But I don't see that faith is a belief without evidence. I think faith is an active trust in the evidence that we have. Okay, here's the cosmos or something, or whatever evidence you want to offer. Act in accordance with that. Okay, if you believe by faith, that God is, then do this. And so it's in those steps, of those practical steps, Tom. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's like, okay, I believe this. What does that look like walked out? And so what I said earlier about watching how God's people die, we die to ourselves. I knew those people needed that car. I knew God wanted me to give them that car. I didn't know what that would entail for me. It was kind of a mini death. I went a year and a half without a car of my own. And it was kind of a mini death. And it was a lot of difficulty and wondering if I did the right thing. I lost a few friends over that. But in the end, it seemed to have worked out to the glory of God. I mean, neither of us were millionaires. It's not like they bought me a new car or something, but we're both providing each other's needs, dying to ourselves, and exalting God and trusting in God. And so that's just one practical way. You just kind of walk out what you believe, and that's the best I could say to you. You know, if you want to see practical evidence, just watch how genuine Christians try to love each other and love people that don't believe. You know, I think that's one thing.
Well, I mean, I see when I compare that to other societies like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, all the Japan, all the atheistic societies where there's majority non-religious people, they do the same things. Like actually charity is better in non-religious societies. And giving is better in non-religious societies. There is less poverty in non-religious societies. There's better education in non-religious societies. All of those things, and when we look at the non-religious societies, they do all the same thing and have the same results without belief in a God. Like there's nothing, the belief in God doesn't do anything there. It's just a post hoc or ad hoc justification for why it succeeded, when really it succeeds equally or better everywhere else. It doesn't change anything. The belief in God is just a motivation kind of a thing, which is this people have a different motivation in other societies. And we know that's a part of evolution. We know that societies that are cooperative and help each other survive better than societies that are selfish and self-centered. And so the fact that there are societies that help each other out and give each other cars or food or help with charity and poverty is a part of evolution. We know that happens. We know why that works. And the faith thing doesn't seem to add anything. Again, it's the exact same as all the non-faith societies. So that doesn't seem to give us a way to differentiate the Jesus example from all the other imaginary examples. So you said we have to use the evidence and live in accordance with how we see the evidence. But as far as I can tell, you haven't presented any evidence. You just said, here are my justifications and feelings about how I imagine these things, like the effects on depression and helping societies work. But we know the same effects on depression and the same effects on helping societies exist in every culture all over the world, and actually more so in less religious societies, more secular societies. So again, I don't see that as evidence at all for God existing.
Well, I think a couple of thoughts come to mind. There's a lot to address there, and if I ramble, Tom, just stop me. If I'm not answering your question, just stop me, because I ramble. So I'll try to address your questions as best I can. So number one, I think C.S. Lewis did this years ago. I'm not claiming anything novel here. In I think it's Mere Christianity. Oh no, The Abolition of Man. At the end of the book, he comes to what he calls the Tao, where he surveys ancient and contemporary cultures, the mores, the religious strictures, the moral strictures that every culture has shared over the years. So I think the interesting question here is, given the universality of things like compassion, charity is from the Greek word charis or charis, which means grace. So you have the universality of this justice. We all desire justice. If you've wronged me, there's a wrong, it needs to be righted. This idea of justice, this idea of compassion, this idea of helping the poor, this idea of giving to people that are in need, this idea of considering others better than yourself, even the edict from Jesus to love your enemies or to respect your elders. There's a cross-cultural universality about all of these aspects that I think cannot finally be explained by natural selection, because given natural selection, if materialism is true, or philosophical materialism, I don't know where you are on that. I don't want to presume, but
I'm a philosophical naturalist. I think naturalism.
Okay, I assume I thought maybe that's what I'd heard you say that before, but let's grant philosophical naturalism to be the case, and that we are evolutionarily accidents or unintended creatures of the cosmos that has become self-aware or something to that nature. The method itself, I think Sean Carroll describes this in an essay in Science and Christianity. This volume, in fact, right here, the Blackwell Companion to Science and Christianity. Sean Carroll has an essay in it. Let's see if I can flip to it. Anyway, the thought is, oh yeah, here it is. Over the past 500 years, the progress of science has worked to strip away God's roles in the world. And what I think is confused here, Tom, I'm not saying you necessarily, but I think in philosophical naturalism, what I think is confused is method versus ontology. So method becomes the sort of divine ontology uh, for a naturalistic worldview. So we have the scientific method, or whatever, however you want to describe that, the material, what do you call it, methodological naturalism, right? Which is just kind of one more step, and you're a philosophical naturalist. But I think the methodology of science has ontologically sort of taken the place of God, small g, that with this unassailable method that we can approach the truth of the universe. But if you look at the pronouncements in the last 100 years, if you want to go back to Einstein, about the cosmos, what do you see in the science popularizers today, especially maybe since Carl Sagan in the 80s? You see this repeated mantra that we are cosmically insignificant. I'm sure you've heard that. Sagan has said that. He said that we are an inconsequential film we are a thin film on an inconsequential lump of rock and metal. Sean Carroll says the universe is just a brute fact, and maybe we have doppelgangers out there in the Everett's many worlds. What was it, Bertrand Russell, that said we are an accidental collocation of atoms. And so we have this.
Richard Dawkins too, which
yeah, Richard Dawkins, right? We just dance to the music of DNA. There's no right or wrong. This is the universe we would expect if it's all blind, purposeless, and causeless. But I think what we're dealing with today in society, Tom, is people feeling a tremendous burden of being told repeatedly by science that they are. Carroll says in his Big Picture, the book Big Picture, he says we are organized blobs of mud. So this is just, I think, just the sort of just a sampling of examples of how we're repeatedly being told by science that we are cosmically insignificant. We're mud. If you take the physics to its absolute end, down to the quark or whatever other subatomic particles are beyond the quark, what are we, Tom? Mud that is mostly empty space. What are the moral, philosophical, ethical implications of being an accidental blob of mud that is mostly empty space? People are going to interpret that one way or another. And I think a lot of people take that, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, that suicide becomes the respectable alternative in such a world. It was the late apologist Francis Schaeffer that said.
I don't think I'm not sure if I'm following your argument here. So science, you're right, is a method. It's not an ontology. So it doesn't tell us anything about the ontology of the world. It's just a way that we can differentiate real things from imaginary things.
Yeah, you just said it. A method cannot determine the quality or kind of ontology that we experience in the world. I would agree.
Right, and scientists agree with that. Scientists aren't saying we can. So all science does is it gives us, if we have a thing and we want to know if this thing is real or imaginary, we have to use some methodology to test, is this real or imaginary? And that's all science does. So the reason all of those scientists are saying that the universe is blind, pitiless indifference is because we have no method that can show that purpose is a real thing and not an imaginary thing, which means that we are reasonable to conclude there is no such thing as purpose or reason or purpose or meaning in the universe outside of our imagination. Now, as a philosopher, I think that we can find purpose and meaning purely as abstract objects like math and logic, so we don't need it to exist in the world, and then we can have it without that. So I mean, I believe, I'm a moral realist, so I believe there is objective morality and purpose and meaning, but it doesn't come from like a law of nature that exists independently of us in the universe, and that's totally fine. So the fact that science shows we don't have a way to differentiate these things from imaginary just means they're probably imaginary, and that's not a problem. So I don't know why, like, the fact that if our meaning and purpose came from a God or whatever, you would still need some way to show that that's a real thing and not an imaginary thing. And science can't do that. Science shows it's probably imaginary. So what is your method to show that the meaning and purpose given from a God, other than the fact that it asserts we have that in the Bible, is actually real and not just imaginary?
Okay, I think I'm following you. Again, stop me if I'm not. I think, again, going back to a couple of, I have personal experiences as evidence of it. You would expect if God of the Bible is personal as we claim, that it would be personal to me. It wouldn't just be something that happened to me 27 years ago, that there would be day-to-day evidences of God speaking and working in my life. So I have that. I mean, I think that is, to me, epistemically, that would count as evidence. Now, it might not be.
You're absolutely right. So, like, for example, if just to use a ridiculous example I can come up with, if I prayed to a god, like, God, give me a gold brick, and a gold brick appears in front of me, and tomorrow I pray to God, God, give me a gold brick, and a gold brick appears in front of me, that would be great evidence of a god. So yeah, if there is a god who is a personal relationship, who does act in your life and answers prayers, and you can interact with on a regular basis, that would be evidence on a personal basis. Now, I can't demonstrate it to anybody else because they're not going to see the gold brick. So personal experience is always first person. It would only apply to evidence for you. It wouldn't apply for evidence for anybody else. No one else could actually use this as evidence. So when we want evidence, it needs to be something anyone can use. So the fact that you have a personal experience with God on a daily basis could count as evidence for you, but it wouldn't for me. And the fact that I have a personal experience where there isn't one would mean evidence for me that there isn't a God. So personal experience is a terrible basis of evidence to try and show that God isn't imaginary, because it would only work for you in the first place. It doesn't matter what kind of personal experience you could tell me about. You could tell me that God literally did create gold bricks for you every day. I mean, I couldn't verify that, so it would be terrible evidence for me. So
No, I get you. I understand what you're saying. That experience is subjective. I mean, I'm not denying that. I'm not saying that my personal experiences are objective, empirical proofs of God's existence. That would be silly. I don't claim to do that at all. Excuse me. If you don't mind, I had an idea come as you were speaking. I want to read from a couple of my favorite theologians. This might surprise you, but
sure.
I say this to myself. I'm not putting you down by this. So please don't think I'm making fun of you or anything, because I'm not. This is me. A couple of my favorite theologians are Frog and Toad. You ever read Frog and Toad?
I don't think so. Not.
You never read Frog and Toad? This is
so.
This is my elementary school. They're great. They're little, first, second grade readers. But I used to teach, just background, I used to teach elementary school. Kids love this book. I would read to them, and I would do voices, and it was a lot of fun. But I found Arnold Lobel was Jewish, the man who wrote Frog and Toad. And there's a lot of Jewish midrash in there. There's a lot of Jewish wisdom in these books. And so I call Frog and Toad my Old Testament theologians, and I think they are. But I say this to myself to answer your question. I am going to answer. This is not a sidetrack. But there's a story in this book called The Garden, where Frog is kind of the wise sage rabbi, and Toad's kind of the guy that learns trial by fire. Frog has a garden. Toad sees the garden. Toad is envious of the garden, and Toad wants to have a garden, right? And so Frog says, "Well, you take some seeds, Toad, and you plant them, and you'll grow, and you'll have a garden." And so Toad is frustrated. He wants the seeds to grow immediately. So Toad obviously doesn't understand how seeds work, right? And he starts yelling at his seeds. Now seeds start growing. Toad looked at the ground again. The seeds did not start to grow. He yells at the seeds. Frog hears him yelling at the seeds. He's like, "What are you shouting at your seeds for?" Right? And Frog tells him to leave him alone. But then Toad goes back and he reads him stories by candlelight. He sings them songs and all this stuff. He does all this work. Of course, that has nothing to do with agrarian farming. And then Toad falls asleep. And days later, what happens? There are seeds. So I'm kind of like Toad, Tom. In one sense, I know very little about God in a true sense. In one sense, I know I should be planting seeds, and that's what I do as a Christian. I tell people my personal experience and share with them what I think is evidence for God. But then sometimes in my early walk, Tom, I shout at people. I yell at people. I do embarrassing things. I try to force people to see my arguments. And if you're not persuaded by my arguments, you've seen this a lot. People get frustrated, right? People get angry with you when you're not persuaded. People see. And so me, I start yelling at my seeds. I start shouting. I start singing songs. I start doing all this stuff. And then finally, what happens? I fall asleep. And God does the work. It's what the Apostle Paul says, that I plant, somebody waters, Paul waters, somebody plants, but God gives the increase. And so the best I can do, Tom, as a finite human being created in the image of God, is plant a seed to give you some food for thought. And if you don't find it, of any evidence, there's nothing I can do to make that seed grow inside of you. My job is to sow and to share. And so getting to the heart of your question, the difference between, what we see in the world and versus a belief in God is really, again, it is, as you said, it's not convincing to you, but that is in accordance with the reality how you perceive reality, as it is in accordance with how I perceive reality. But I think the difference is, Tom, that for me as a Christian, that God works through me despite all the things that I do and don't do, that God continues to work through my foibles and sins. And And so the I think the evidence issue really is one of, okay, we can talk about objective evidence. Are there really seeds coming out of the ground? Did I really use seeds? Am I really speaking truth? Are the seeds that I'm talking about, are they really true? And then, or is it just a matter of being convinced? Because I think there's two different
Oh, right, right,
things
absolutely.
going on there. So are you? So is evidence? So we can say that evidence might not be convincing for
right,
any.
right. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying those what you're talking about are objectively not seeds. Those are not seeds. Those are pebbles. Pebbles don't grow. They are literally objectively don't work in any way. They don't count as evidence in anything. So, for example, the point of me saying that when you have an experience of believing in God and having that have an impact on depression in some way or keep you from suicide or whatever, that same thing can be said of all these other things that are not God. So if for example, if I have a lucky rabbit's foot in my pocket, and if I have a lucky rabbit's foot and I find a $20 bill on the ground, I'm like, oh, it must have been because of the lucky rabbit's foot. Well, then if we test that hypothesis and say only people with a lucky rabbit's foot find $20 bills, or if you have a lucky rabbit's foot, it increases your probability of finding a $20 bill. We find out that's false. Like, no, it has no impact at all. It has 0% impact on whether or not your chances of finding a $20 bill. So when you add faith into the equation or a God into the equation, does this increase the probability of whatever effect you're looking at? In the case of personal experience, the answer is no. We can prove for a fact it does not in any way have a discernible impact, more so than anything else we can see in reality. And the same with the other cases, the personal experience, the having an impact in your life, the curing of depression. Every single example you have, we have like lots and lots and lots of tests in psychology and sociology of these things, and we know for a fact those do not work. They are exactly like the lucky rabbit's foot. There is no discernible difference. Therefore, those aren't seeds. Those don't count as seeds at all. They're just rocks.
I think my question would be, let's say, for example, I'm looking for my pen in my study here, and I can't find it, and I say, there's no evidence of my favorite silver pen in my study. Now, that doesn't make any sense if I don't know what I'm talking about, right? Well, what does your pen look like? I'll help you find it. Well, I don't know what it looks like. Well, that doesn't work, does it? I mean, I have to, if I say I can't find X, I'm assuming that I would know what X is if I found it. Would you agree with that?
I think so. Yes. If you don't know what
Yeah,
X
I'm not
is,
trying to be tricky. I'm just saying, look, if I say there's no evidence for my pen in the study, I should know what the evidence for the pen would be if I found it. Ah, here it is. See, it's silver. It's clicky. All that
it's
stuff.
like if somebody came into my room and like, I lost X. Can you help me find X? And they're like, yeah, sure, I'll help you find X. What's X?
Right. Well, what is X? Right. Are you talking about the letter X? Here it is. I could draw an X or whatever. So, I'm not trying to be philosophically astute or anything. So I think when it comes to God, I think the question is, if I were to say there's no evidence for God, I think that falls into the classification of a subjective kind of understanding of evidence that would convince me, let's say. So that would be in the realm of subjectivity to say there's no evidence for God.
Well, I would object to that. So I would say that, again, evidence is that which can differentiate imagination from reality. So that's an objective qualifier. It's not subjective. Subjective is
Okay, so
relevant.
all right. Well, let me back up then and reiterate so I understand better. So your definition of evidence is, let me make sure I say it so I understand what you're saying. Your definition of evidence is that which can help us differentiate between the real. When you say real, you're talking, I'm assuming as a materialist, you're talking about sensory perception,
No,
correct?
no, no. So my definition of evidence is that which can differentiate imagination from reality.
Okay, so reality.
But not. I'm not talking about naturalism here. So there could be a supernatural realm of reality, and you would still need a method to show that isn't imaginary. And the method doesn't need to be testable. It doesn't need to be natural. It could be any method you want. Any method that can do this would count as evidence. Now, the only method I know of is science, but that is irrelevant. So any method you can do works.
So you accept the possibility of a supernatural realm in your definition of reality. Could be.
Absolutely.
Okay. So what would be, again, for you, I'm not playing trick games or whatever, but just so I know your terms, how do you perceive a definition, or what's your root definition of supernatural?
A non-physical consciousness is usually what I go with.
Non-physical, so there's consciousness there.
Yeah, so when people usually say supernatural, they're usually talking about a ghost or a fairy or something that has consciousness and it's doing something in reality. Usually, if it's just a force, it's usually not considered supernatural.
So so when you talk about supernature, you differentiate that from metaphysical. So there could be a physical thing beyond our physical world, but that would be metaphysical. But for you, in order to be supernatural, you don't conflate metaphysics and supernatural. These are two different.
No, metaphysics is just the fundamental properties of the reality. So it could be anything could be metaphysics. Supernatural could be metaphysics, or supernatural could be made of something else,
okay.
and that something else is metaphysics.
Well, some people, intertwine that, and it's kind of a confusing muddle. I just wanted to know what you were thinking. So supernatural for you is something beyond the physical that has
Yes, essentially.
Okay, so is that so you would grant at least the possibility of a supernatural ontology, and I don't mean in
Sure.
terms of the physical
Yeah,
body.
yeah. Supernatural consciousness could definitely exist. There's no problem with that. It's not a logical contradiction.
So if we just stick with empirical science, if we just go with the methods and the tools of science, what we observe, and I have a very very simple understanding of ontology of just the idea of being, right? Physical being, grass, trees, rabbits, tomatoes.
Well, ontology is the study of what exists. Physical being is just one kind of
Yeah,
existence.
right. The existence of something, and so what we see, I think, in terms of biology in the living world, we see being coming from being. I mean, that's just scientific, right? I mean, that's just methodological naturalism. If we stuck to that,
What?
where does
I don't understand that. Being coming from being. I don't understand that at all.
right? Well, like seeds again. Like if I plant I think I have a seed here. So if I plant one of these when it has seeds in it, I'm going to get a pine tree, right? From the seed cone comes what? A tree. I'm not going to get tomatoes if I plant this, or corn, or wheat, or if robins mate in the spring, they're going to have baby robins. If cows mate, they're going to have cattle. If dogs mate, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I'm saying, that these beings specifically come from their kind, if you will, or their species. That a dog begets a dog, a sheep begets a sheep, a seed begets a certain kind of fruit. That's all I'm saying. Would you
Okay.
agree with that?
Um, Mostly yes, but then when it comes to quantum mechanics, no, because things can pop into existence, virtual particles and stuff. But I, what, how does that relate to your argument? Because I don't know how that.
Well, even if you want to talk about a virtual particle popping into existence, it still has the ontology of a virtual particle. We're not talking about root beer popping into existence. We're talking about some kind of subatomic particle that has the properties that enables it to be inside a quantum vacuum. So you will consistently see virtual particles. You will consistently find virtual particles popping into existence, and not candy canes or rabbits or cardinals. And so there's a nature of that. We might not know what it is, but that doesn't mean we should abandon Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. We just don't know what the reason is for these particles coming into existence. But what I'm saying is that in the physical scientific world, it's just an unknown on the physical level. But primarily, being begets being. I mean, being begets like being. I mean, if I have children, they're going to be children and not sheep or doves or chickens, thankfully. That's all I'm saying. Scientifically, we see being coming from being. So my simple position would be that the biological life from grass to grasshoppers to presidents and kings, that these beings ultimately emanate from a supernatural being who is beyond and above our
Why?
universe. Because that just
Because it seems like
because
let me see if I can steelman your argument here. You're saying that everything that begins to exist has a cause. There must be something that didn't begin to exist to be the first cause, kind of a thing.
well, just nature begetting nature, Tom. I don't even have to go into the Kalam necessarily. Just the origin of being. So you have two possible origins of. I'm just speaking of biological life here for just a second. That we see scientifically, we see living things begetting living things. You plant winter wheat, you're going to get winter wheat. You plant corn, et cetera, et cetera. So if we trace all that back, we have, as I see it, we have two options. We have a naturalistic option that, and I know this isn't the realm of Darwinian evolution, it's just abiogenesis. You have a naturalistic evolution of some kind of DNA RNA mechanism that sort of self-assembles at some point in the Earth's early history. You have that option on the table. You have Francis Crick's option of panspermia, some sort of alien race sending a meteor with some biological life that survives Earth entry and starts the whole process. Or you have a supernatural being, which I think is the creator of the universe, which is Christ, which is what I prefer, because I see being coming from being, and all of this design in nature does seem to emanate from a mind. Well, like, just for example, in nature, in flowers, I'm sure you know this. The bottom of the pine cone, there's a few sequences here missing, but you know what the sequence is at the bottom of pine cones and flowers and sunflowers. You know what this is called?
Yeah, golden ratio.
Golden ratio. So if we were to count all this and to do the math, we would come up with numbers 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144, blah, 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 all the way down the line. And if you divide the one number into the larger number, you always get a ratio, as you say, of 1.6. And this is in everything from flowers to pine cones to galaxies, you name it. The Fibonacci sequences, even in art and music, it seems to be the wonderful mathematical golden ratio in all of nature, even from galaxies all the way to sunflowers, this 1.618 or something like that. And to me, that bespeaks of a mind. Not only do we have this ontology of living things, but we have this mathematical resonance that math can there's a number sequence that ties this together with Andromeda, and that's just fabulous. And
so there's two things there. I think I wanted. One is the Fibonacci sequence it's a physical consequence, because like if you had take an object of size X and then you put it next to another object of the exact same size and you put it below it, necessarily the distance from that you're putting it below it is going to displace it a certain percentage. And if you continue to place those objects in a line, you're going to necessarily get the golden ratio. It has nothing to do with a mind there. It's just literally just physics. If you just take a spiral and you spiral things down in a greater circle, it's always going to get the Fibonacci sequence. So there's not really anything special about that. It's just a description of exponential growth. That's it. There's no real.
Think you don't find there to be any persuasive argument that the bottom of a pine cone and galaxies, spiral galaxies like Andromeda, are connected by this Fibonacci sequence. Why would a pine cone spiral and a galaxy spiral be one in the same ratio?
Because all spirals have the same ratio.
Yeah, and that, to me, I think that's where we'll probably disagree. That I see that as evidence of design. And I couldn't do that.
All circles are circles. So I mean, why would that be evidence of design?
Well, I mean, you look at the mathematical, what I would call the mathematical resonance. We have a chapter in our book by Melissa Cain-Travis. I don't know where my book is. Here it is. We have a chapter in our book written by Melissa Cain-Travis talking about the mathematical resonance of the universe. And I think it's remarkable. And it's something Einstein said, that the most unintelligible thing about the universe is that it is intelligible. And part of that intelligibility, or the great aspect of that intelligibility, does seem to be mathematics. The applicability of mathematics to everything from distant stars down to blades of grass, that we can do. We can do math on nearly everything. We can describe things in quantities and qualities and distances. And the little number systems, whether you think we discovered them or created them, that our little counting systems on our fingers have resonance with something 2.5 million light years away, or even further light years away. That this math seems to be, as Galileo said, the language that God used to create the universe. And so I think that the mathematical intelligibility of the cosmos and the created order bespeaks of a mind.
Well, how so? Because math is a language just like English. So the fact that we can use math to describe galaxies and pine cones, we can also use English to describe galaxies and pine cones.
Sure,
and math has the same problems as English, because you can have mathematical formulations that don't describe reality, like E equals MC cubed. Like that doesn't describe reality. Or you can have math that has logical contradictions. Like you have a married bachelor, you can have 1 equals 2 or 1 plus 1 equals 7. Like you can have mathematical formulations that are wrong or that are inaccurate, and you can have mathematical formulations that are contradictory and illogical. Math is just a language like any other language. It describes reality, so of course you can use it to describe universes and pine cones, just like you use English to describe universes and pine cones. The fact that it's a human construction wouldn't be evidence of a god any more than the English language would be evidence of a god.
Well, I just find it interesting that, more than interesting. So let's take what John says about Jesus in the Logos. In his prologue and in the opening of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, John's use of the word "word" is the Greek word for logos, which means an order or arrangement. And so the Greek world, up until that point, was very familiar with what the logos was. If you go back to Democritus and others who came after him, that all is atoms in the void, that the gods didn't create anything, that the cosmos is eternal. And this is what Carl Sagan hit on that most people sort of miss. I mean, now we use cosmos and universe interchangeably. But Sagan, he was actually on Johnny Carson in 1977 explaining the difference between the Greek idea of cosmos, which means everything ordered, and the universe, which is contained within the cosmos. And that's a distinction that some people are aware of, some people aren't. But anyway, the Greek idea of cosmos is this order and arrangement. And so John rocks the Greek world with his prologue, and he says, well, you know what, guys? The Logos is actually a person in the person in the flesh of Jesus. So logos is the same root word from where we get logic. And of course, language has to be logical. We have the laws of non-contradiction, the laws of the excluded middle, things of that nature. And then we have mathematical laws. As you say, Tom, there's a great deal of precision in numerical reality, because you have to, 1 + 7 does never equal 8, doesn't matter what, or never equals anything else other than 8. It doesn't matter what planet you're on, doesn't matter what part of the galaxy you're on. If you're on an astronaut in space station, 1, 2 + 2 is 4, whether you're way up there or down here. This mathematical resonance has a great precision, and that can differentiate between truth and error. This mathematical quantity is always this and nothing else but that. It's not X and not X at the same time. And so language, I just did an interview with, here it is, Malcolm Guite, Faith, Hope, and Poetry. And we talked about the poetry of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Are you familiar with Coleridge's work?
Nope.
Okay, so Coleridge's idea was, he was very much into the language. He was a Christian. He struggled with heroin addiction, but he was a genuine Christian, wrote wonderful poetry. But Malcolm and I talked about Coleridge's use of the word. And as you identified, I think you actually have a Coleridgean view of language, Tom. That if I say the word star, what comes to your mind?
The sun.
Sun, okay. You have a visual picture in your head of a star, right?
Yes.
So how did that image get into your mind? Well, the wavelengths, the sound in the air, it's just waves of sound, right? But that somehow engendered in your mind a picture of the sun. And I didn't say sun, I said star. But yet you went to sort of this mental picture of a star. And that's what language does. And I think you would agree. I think that's what you were saying, that if I say star, the word star isn't the thing, right?
Yeah.
It's a transport. It's a vehicle that takes you to the actual object itself. And so what Coleridge is arguing, and what this is kind of the way I see it as well, that if we take the language that we're familiar with, that there is a transcendent quality to it. In other words, it's translucent. We can see through the word star to the actual thing itself. It's a conveyor of something. And so what Coleridge would argue would be that the stars and the physical world, the created order, there was one time where Coleridge was on an afternoon walk, and a friend of his asked, "Where are you going, Samuel?" And he says, "I'm off to a chemistry lecture to get more metaphors about God." And Coleridge believed that the physical world, Tom, was actually like a language unto itself. It was like divine language, because if you take Genesis 1, how does God create? Of course, he speaks things into existence. Now, this is sort of an anthropic description for us to be able to understand, but somehow through God's verbal commands, creation comes to be. And so Coleridge would argue that the trees and leaves and stars are like words themselves.
Oh, wait. I don't know if I'm following here. So words are representations of things in the world. We have like the word pine cone. The word pine cone is a made up thing in the human mind. It has nothing special about it. The reason it's abstract is because we made it up. We can make it anything we want. There are lots of different languages with lots of different words.
Sure. So
language is just a made up thing in our head, like a unicorn or a pixie or a leprechaun. And so the real world is a separate thing. We use these ideas to represent something in reality, and there are certain words that don't represent things in reality, like leprechauns, unicorns, fairies, etc. So math is the same way. Math is, again, just an abstract representation, just like the word pine cone. Some of them represent things in the world, some of them don't represent things in the world, and some of them represent self-contradictions, like a married bachelor. You can't ever have a married bachelor, no matter what, in any universe, just because of what the words mean. So math is... You can't, 1 + 1 can never equal 7 just because that's what the words mean. We could change the meaning of the words, that'd be totally fine. Just like we can change the meaning of the words of married and bachelor. So again, math isn't prescriptive. It isn't something that's like requires a mind to exist. Like the universe doesn't require a mind to be created in an orderly way. We make the math in our minds to describe the universe. And all it is describing the fact that of what reality is like. That's it. So there's no reason that the evidence or orderliness of math would be indicative of a mind, because it's not. It's something we're applying to the universe. It doesn't exist in the universe. Math doesn't exist in the universe anywhere.
But you are saying that math is a product of mind. You are saying that.
Yes, math is a product of human minds.
Yeah. So you would say that it is an artifact of intelligence, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you would adduce that you would agree that there is such a thing as human intelligence even as well, right?
I'll
Would
give
you
that one
say
a
that?
50-50. Human
Okay,
intelligence. I don't know. Donald Trump exists. It's a
no
tough
problem, no
call.
problem. No problem. So the idea of what you just find, you believe that we invented math, we didn't discover it.
Yes, I can actually give you a date and the people who did.
Okay, I'm not setting up for any kind of thing, but I think there was probably I'm philosophically I believe math was discovered in some sense. Now, but I would say there was um, maybe like art in some sense that maybe not exactly, maybe not the best example, but we could discover that we had artistic skills, right? You discover you have a skill or ability, and you're like, ooh, this is kind of cool. So you make the discovery that you're good at X. I can make pi, or I can play the guitar pretty easy, or I can write books, or whatever. You have this sort of discovery that where you participate in it, but it also seems to be a kind of a gift, right? So there's this exchange where I feel like my skills and abilities as a Christian, obviously, I would say that God has built me a certain way to do certain things. Um, and I would find that that would be sort of a gift. God has given me a gift of X, Y, and Z. So I discover that. But then there's also the participatory aspect of appreciating and using and utilizing that gift. And I think mathematics would be, and I know we would disagree, but I think mathematics is kind of like that. We discover it, but then we use it to discover the world around us. And so like Blaise Pascal, I think, and others, was it Newton and Pascal that came up with, what was it?
Calculus.
Calculus. Yeah. So here are two individuals that come up with kind of the same thing, and they kind of invented it, kind of discovered it at the same time. So that to me, this suggests that mathematics is like language itself, like intelligibility, if you will, something discovered, but that's something that we use as well. So it's a kind of a combinatorial thing, not just
So do
one.
you think English was discovered?
Language certainly is. Yes, language was a gift. So as I believe that when God breathed, we are spirit. God breathed His Spirit into us, which gave us the mind, intelligibility, all those kinds of those abstractions that we talk about, the theory of mind and stuff like that. That intelligibility comes with the ability to that gift of language. And so we have that as an innate gift that we just, we're like babies, right? They discover, hey, I can say dada and get dad's attention. I can say dar and get, I can talk about a car, or blah, 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 if I mean fish. The baby is learning linguistic things, and he's kind of like, it's kind of fun if I say food and he can smack his table. He learns. He's got this gift of communicating that seems to be able to get him the things that he wants.
Yeah, but
So
English itself, like it didn't exist before humans. English wasn't a thing, right? It's just a made up human construction.
right. So I would say it's something like an automobile. That the basic combustion engine, four wheels, four cylinders, whatever. This idea of a horseless carriage is pretty much, you need to have some basics to have a combustion engine four-wheel automobile. Now you can have very many designs on top of that, and I think that's kind of what language is. There's an undercarriage, a frame, a basic. You need a combustion engine, you need wheels and brakes and whatnot. But there's a variety of different things, like there's a variety of different automobiles. But the structure and idea and concept of the automobile is generally underlying that principle. Like morality, I think in some sense that there may be different moralities in different cultures, but the underlying aspect of morality is a thing. And so I think language is a gift, and English just happens to be one variety, like a fruit on a tree, apples and cherries and bananas. They're all fruits, but it's really the same kind of thing
So the
altogether.
logical structure is the thing you're talking about.
Yeah, the logical structure coming from Christ, the Logos, he is the source of that. For me, that's what I believe.
Okay,
That
so logic for me is also just a language. It's again just completely,
Yeah,
totally human made up. There's nothing special about it. There's no special connection. A does not always need to equal A. There's paraconsistent logics where you can have true, false, and both true and false at the same time. There's quantum logics, intuitionist logics. All of those things are again just human language. There's nothing special about them. They're not a part of the universe. They don't require anything outside of the universe. It's just a human made up thing to describe reality, and that's it. And there's problems with logic. We know logic is again just a human invention because there's problems with it, just like any human language, like Gödel's incompleteness theorem 1 and 2, and the Vinci-Scolam theorem. We know that logic is just a flawed human language to describe stuff. That's it, just like English. So those relations that you're talking about aren't transcendental. They're not something that exists outside of a human mind. It's just a human mind making connections and describing things, and that's it. So again, you could just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, classical logic, very first sentence. Classical logic is a formal language in a system of semantics. That's it. So those connections that you are saying that exist between language are also just human made up connections. They're not actual things. They just describe reality. And so it doesn't seem to me like there's any problem with saying reality is just a natural, eternal, natural thing. And we are just making up these languages to describe reality. And there's nothing special about math or logic or language in any sense. They're just descriptive properties. So the other thing you brought up a while ago was the being from non-being kind of a thing. Like, I see no problem with saying that there is a natural thing that could either exist eternally, like the universe, or there's a natural thing that can exist outside of space-time, like many theists claim a God is, without any consciousness. So either one of those could be explained and are better explanations of the being from non-being, or where did the universe come from, and math and logic and language than a God is. It seems like God is just a God of the gaps kind of a thing, where we don't know how this was created, therefore we're going to say God did it, when we can come up with better solutions that are grounded in things we have evidence for, like reality, without the evidence of a God for those things.
Well, I see. I just kind of one thing for clarity. It seems like if language is just a subjective, are you suggesting that language is just a subjective tool for us to describe things?
Yes.
That's it. There's no ontological reality to the things we're describing, or are there?
The things we're describing exist, but the language is purely arbitrary. It's completely subjective. We make up all the things of the language is stuff we made up. We just use the language to describe stuff that exists independently.
So how do you escape the dilemma of your language being nothing more than just a description?
We need some way to differentiate imagination. Wait, language is just a description. What do you mean?
So you're telling me that, I mean, you just said so a few minutes ago, the idea that we could describe being from non-being, or something eternal like our universe, or something beyond it that is natural, unconscious. These seem to be also in the realm of verbal description. How do you differentiate that those are genuinely real possibilities and not just something linguistically that you've created for yourself?
All right, that's the thing I brought up earlier. We need some way to differentiate imagination from reality. And the way we do that is with science. It's also a human made up concept, science, the scientific methodology, but it works to differentiate real things from imaginary things. For example, if I say, this is a cup, I mean, the word cup is completely imaginary. It doesn't exist anywhere in the universe. You're never going to find the word cup. Same with math and logic. They're just made up things to describe the cup. The cup exists. We can demonstrate the cup exists using science. It's not imaginary, even though all of the things we use to describe it are imaginary.
If I was a quantum physicist and I use science to describe the cup, I'm going to come to the conclusion that the cup is mostly empty space.
Yep, that's also true.
So how do you know that your language, in the way in which you just described language, isn't just a verbal description of things?
Language is just a verbal description of things. So
Right.
the
So
cup is like a description of mostly empty space with protons and neutrons and electrons.
right. So what I'm saying is that these verbal descriptions that you're giving me, how do you know they're ontologically real?
The verbal descriptions are just descriptions. They're not ontologically real, but the things
So
they refer to are ontologically real.
right. So you're saying that this cup or that is real, but I'm hearing you say, on the one hand, well, real is just a word. It's just language. We're just described, but so I don't know how you're escaping your descriptions from your own descriptions of descriptions. If you say real, I'm assuming that you're meaning something by real.
Right.
But then I'm forced to conclude by your own epistemology, that every word that you say are just words. So I don't know how to say that you've got the handle on reality here, rather than, by your own definition, you just seem to be trading in words too, like I am. We seem to be stuck epistemologically and being able to transcend our vocabulary in some sense, to be able to, we seem bereft of being able to say that's a real cup.
Right. So truth is that which corresponds to reality. So whether the sentence, which is completely made up, whether that sentence accurately describes reality or not. And to know if a sentence accurately describes reality or not, we need some method to differentiate imagination from reality. And the method we use is science, novel testable predictions.
Reality is made up, if we go with physical materialism, reality is made up of physical things. And we know from quantum mechanics and modern physics that mostly even solid things like steel is mostly empty space. So
Yes.
what What do we mean by real?
The things. So again, real is just the things that are not imaginary. They exist independent of our imagination. The things that exist.
Are you imagining a cup?
Yes.
Aren't you imagining a cup?
Yes.
I
So
mean,
there's a picture of a cup in my head, and this is
yeah.
imaginary, and then there is an actual cup here, which is not imaginary.
See, now hold on. See, that is what I'm confused about. You say that's an actual cup. And I'm
Yes.
saying no. It's just science says it's just mostly empty space.
Those are the same thing. So mostly empty space and actual cup is still the same thing. So because the
Oh, you just
mostly
said
empty
you made up
space
cup.
exists outside of my imagination. So there's
But
the imaginary what?
you just said that you made up cup.
The,
You
the
made that
word
word.
the word cup is made up.
Okay. Well,
And there's
why wouldn't the empty space description be made up too?
because the empty space exists, well, the description is made up, but the empty space exists independent of my imagination. If I stop imagining the empty space, it's still going to be there.
So reality is empty space.
Mostly empty space with protons and neutrons and electrons.
Okay, but is that a real sentence about reality?
The sentence is true, so it corresponds to reality. The sentence itself is made up, though. It's still true.
But how could you have a sentence you've made up that corresponds with reality if reality is mostly empty space? You're saying my sentence corresponds with empty space.
Yeah, yes. So a reality is the stuff that exists regardless of your imagination. So there's the imaginary stuff, which is only true if I imagine it, like I'm imagining a unicorn. And then there's the stuff in reality, which is true independent of anything you imagine. So it doesn't matter what your imagination does, that stuff can't change. That's what reality is. So when I say that the cup is protons, neutrons, electrons, and empty space, all of those properties are going to still be there regardless of what my imagination does. Math, logic, and language aren't. They're all in my imagination. If I stop imagining, they all go away.
So the logic, reason, mathematics are all for you in the imaginary realm?
Yes, they're all languages. They all just made up in our heads.
Okay, how do we then apply our logic in the app? Because science is an artificial construct made by humans.
Yes.
It's not something nature tells us to do.
Yes.
So how if language is just made up and that reality is mostly empty space, you've made up a language that corresponds to mostly empty space. How can we do science in a world like that?
It's really easy. You say that I have, like, imagine you see a cup fall over. Like, what caused that cup to fall over? Now there's a bunch of different things it could be. It could be a squirrel or a fairy or a leprechaun, magic pixies, a god, asteroid, a bird. There's lots of things it could be. And if I say all these are imaginary, all these are things in my head right now. And I'm going to say, if my hypothesis that it was a squirrel is true, I'm going to make a testable prediction to say we're going to see squirrel droppings around the cup. Now, we don't know yet. We haven't looked. And then we can go and say, we're going to go test this. We're going to go look to see if there are squirrel droppings. And we see the squirrel droppings and say, oh, I was right. So this one hypothesis made future testable predictions, which were confirmed. And that gives us good reason to believe that that hypothesis is describing reality, not something in our imagination. Because we made a prediction about reality, not our imagination. And it was confirmed.
We made a prediction about a squirrel that's mostly empty space. I mean, what is a squirrel?
It's mostly empty space. There's no contradiction there. Like a squirrel is made of protons, neutrons, electrons.
Derive a conclusion about anything. If everything is mostly empty space and our language is made up, it seems like you're bereft of something objectively solid, Tom, epistemologically speaking, that if I'm creating language, I could call a squirrel, like, you know, what babies do when they see grandma, where they have a funny word for grandma, and then grandma's name becomes, it sticks, right? Nana, Nona, whatever. The baby nonsense is, it names grandma. But so if your epistemology really is rooted in sort of languages being made up, and that reality, science studies the physical world, but the physical world is mostly empty space, and the logic and reason mathematics are just imaginations and in the imaginary part of my mind, I don't see how you can arrive at any sort of conclusive idea about objective reality.
I'm not sure I'm following your argument here. So mostly empty space doesn't change anything. So a thing can be, a squirrel is mostly empty space, it's still a squirrel. It doesn't stop it from being a squirrel.
Yeah, but who's defining squirrel? Where's that coming from?
Our heads, we imagined it. We made up a name for squirrel.
Okay, so we just made it up. Why it could be a bear.
Yeah, that we can call it a Klingon if we want to. It doesn't make a difference what we call it.
So how would you know that you're looking at a squirrel finally if we can call it whatever we want to?
Because we can make associations. We can say a squirrel has these properties, and these properties are, it's small, it has a big furry tail, and we have other names for those things that we came up with. And they started with grunts, like, oh, I don't know, and then that we associated that to whatever they were pointing at with our sense experience and said, that's an and then we made more complicated words for that and we built up language. So language is completely arbitrary. We know that the natural ambiguity of language, all words are arbitrary, but they refer to sense experience, which is how we can differentiate the uses of different words.
So your epistemology is sensory experience based on words we've made up about things that are mostly empty space. Is that correct?
Sensory experience is how language was developed to be a specific, how one word, which is arbitrary, was developed to have a specific meaning. It has nothing to do with my epistemology. That's just how language developed. Language developed based off sensory experience.
Right. So earlier on, you said that personal experience is bad evidence for God.
Yes.
So I'm kind of tying back into your idea that personal experience is a very subjective. It's very subjective epistemologically, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we're using personal experience that is very subjective to make up words that describe reality, but reality is mostly empty space. I don't see where we can solve.
Well, I'm not sure. I still don't understand.
Looks like we're swimming in hard solipsism here.
No,
Yep.
absolutely not. So I don't understand why you keep bringing up empty space. Like the fact that things are mostly empty space changes nothing.
I'm sorry. Okay, we can stop. I was just wondering.
So from my perspective, when I said that personal experience is bad evidence of a God, I mean, evidence is, again, that which can differentiate imagination from reality. But if you're only claiming something is imaginary, you don't need to differentiate imagination from reality. So if I said, I'm imagining a unicorn, I don't need to demonstrate there's a unicorn in the world because I'm not claiming there is one. So language, as like the word apple or pine cone or whatever, those are just imaginary. I don't need to differentiate those from real and imaginary. They're just imaginary words. So you only need to differentiate imagination from reality if you're claiming something exists in reality, not your imagination. All language is just in our imagination. So you don't need to do that for language.
Okay, so when you say cup,
yeah,
just to be clear, why is that not something of a product of your imagination?
Because
when you hold it up and you say this is a cup, why isn't that just your own imaginative vocabulary and not something objectively real?
The vocabulary is subjective to a culture, but the vocabulary doesn't matter. The vocabulary is irrelevant. The cup exists independently. The reason we call it a cup is because of thousands of years of sense experience references to language. It's arbitrary. It's totally arbitrary. We just all happen to use the same ones.
Okay. All right. I mean, I don't want to, beat a dead horse. I would just for clarity. Okay. So we would probably, obviously we disagree because I would think, for me personally, that the whole ability to perceive, as we said earlier, the language, the ability to perceive, mathematics, language, speech, intelligibility of the cosmos itself, emanates from Christ, the Logos. The
Why? Why would that be the case rather than just being a product of biology?
Well, again, we go back to the rational intelligibility, the language that John describes Jesus as the Logos, that the cosmos is an arrangement. I mean, when you look at, have you ever been out in a Bortle Class 1 dark sky? Tom, have you ever seen?
I've been out in the dark sky in the middle of Texas where there's no lights. Yes.
Yeah, so you're probably in a Bortle Class 1 or a Class 2 sky, and that Bortle classes describe various stages of light pollution. Class 1 is the darkest kind. It's down in Big Bend. There's a little island of darkness between Amarillo and Wichita here, and it's probably, I'm assuming that may be where you were, maybe down in Big Bend or something. But when you're out underneath the canopy of this, I was just out in Benjamin, Texas the other night. It's about 2 hours from my house. And I parked on the side of the road. I couldn't find the park where I wanted to go, so I parked on the side of the highway, got out. I mean, it's unbelievable. The starry night sky. In fact, I had a hard time locating some of the constellations that I'm familiar with because there were so many other stars around. I'm like, where's the Northern Crown? Where is the this and that? And so when I say this is to say that when we look up at the sky, that we don't just go, ooh, lights. I mean, maybe astronomers do after hours and hours and hours of studying stars, but the reaction that everybody gets, I have a telescope and I share it with people as often as I can. The reaction that most people have when they look through the telescope, they see Saturn's rings, or they see Jupiter's stripes, or they see Jupiter's moons, or they see this dark one, Class 1 sky, is something that the sky itself makes people go, oh my God, or how awesome, or how beautiful, or how wondrous. And so there's nothing in the night sky, or there does seem to be rather something in the night sky, something about this wonderful cloudless starry night sky that elicits something beyond itself.
Yeah, we have a sense of awe, but I don't know what you mean by beyond itself. Like again, that
Well,
seems purely
there's
biological.
nothing in a, I could say from a purely materialistic standpoint, there's nothing in a point of light in the sky that should suggest to you that it's awe-inspiring. I mean, if I want points of light, I can go and get some Christmas lights, right? That's just a point of light that I've arranged. And if it's just a matter of light particles, why that stuff up there? Why does that elicit awe, wonder, and beauty? And what I'm saying is that from a purely materialistic perspective, there's nothing in the chemical of
Yes, yes,
hydrogen.
there is. I mean, like we can get
Well, I mean,
so just to use your example of the lights, the Christmas lights, people get awe and wonder from looking at different combinations of Christmas lights, and just
yeah.
more so than they do from getting at the stars. And some people look at the stars and say, I don't care at all. It's just a bunch of white dots in the sky. That again seems to be purely subjective based off of the individual and their chemical states in their brain. It has nothing to do with the stars themselves. Don't give us any awe. It's just that's how our brains interpret the stars, just like how our brains interpret Christmas lights.
Well, I think we're getting back into that problem of language again. If you want to tell me, which is fine, I'm not saying it one way or the other, but if you want to tell me the stars don't give us this, I think that's an imaginative claim that science can't finally address, right? It's a subjective decision on your part to say that the stars themselves aren't doing that.
Oh, no, I think that's demonstrably provable again, because we can take the psychological states. If the stars are giving us this thing, then we can say, given some kind of test group, does this cause it more often than the other things like music or Christmas lights or paintings or whatever? We can test, we get the same results as the rabbit's foot. Like is the probability that the stars actually cause these things is exactly the same as the rabbit's foot, which is purely based off of the individual. There's no special property they have that gives us those things. We can demonstrate that and prove it.
Well, I think when we're talking about God, especially Jesus of the Bible, ontologically, philosophically, scientifically, uh, Jesus is the creator. He will be by nature, if you want to steel man the theistic position, he is above nature. He is beyond nature. And that for me as a Christian, I look at the heavens, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. And the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day pours forth speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. Now, this was David hundreds of years ago, in 900 BC or something. And you look at, so I worked with, in the book, we worked with a Hubble Space Telescope astronomer, um, and he is a Christian, and he was instrumental in putting together you're familiar with the Hubble Deep Field?
I think
You
so.
know what the Deep Field was? So Bob Williams was the director of the Space Telescope Science Institute back in the I think it was 90, let me see, make sure, 95, yes. So as the director of the Space Telescope Science Institute, Mr. Williams had 10 days to play with the telescope however he wanted. He probably could take a selfie of himself if he wanted to with Hubble. But as a director, he had discretionary director time to do what he wanted to with the telescope. Now, just a few years prior, if you'll remember, that the telescope, its mirror was ground improperly, and we had to send the shuttle up on a very expensive mission to make the adjustments to make the mirror work.
Yeah, because
So
the mirror was
yeah, they didn't grind it
shifted.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it shifted or something. Well, it was ground improperly, I think, at the factory, and they had a little anyway. So they had to send the shuttle up in a very expensive mission. So this is a couple of years after, and Bob Williams is like, I wonder what can I do with the telescope? I mean, what would you do with the telescope for 10 days? So he decides to take the telescope and take a picture of a blank spot of sky underneath the handle of the Dipper, or above the handle of the Dipper, Big Dipper somewhere, for 10 days. This is a starless spot of sky from the ground, and nothing like this has ever been done before. And he's gonna spend a couple of orbits and about $250,000 a day to take these pictures of this blank spot of sky. It was a calculated risk. And what did that yield? Well, it yielded a field of 3,000 galaxies that no human eye had ever seen before. So it was pretty remarkable, pretty almost kind of scary, kind of like Mufasa. Like. But then earlier in the 2000s, Matt Mountain was the director of the Space Telescope Science Institute, and he wanted to sort of one-up Bob. So Matt took this telescope, did some discretionary director time, and pointed it at the constellation of Fornax, the Furnace in the southern hemisphere, and also took a picture of a blank spot of sky Now, from our field of view on the ground, Tom, this spot of sky was no bigger than the eye of Lincoln on the head of a penny, held out at arm's length. So if you can imagine holding out a penny at arm's length, this spot of sky that Matt Mountain focused on was only as big as Lincoln's eye. And so this telescope, the Hubble, went around the Earth, I don't know how many times, 40, I don't know how many times it was, 800 images, 400 orbits. And Dr. Kokomor, who we worked with in the book, processed all that. So they took 800 images and they combined them all into what is now known as the Hubble Extreme Deep Field. Some 10 to 15,000 galaxies exist in a spot of sky no bigger than Lincoln's eye on the head of a penny.
Yep, every spot of sky, everywhere in every direction.
Right. So it's like, whoa. And so now there's this, these Hubble images have caused people to reevaluate the estimation of how many galaxies there are in our universe. Somewhere anywhere between 200 million or 200 billion to 2 trillion. I mean, nobody really knows because nobody really can take a census of all of that.
I mean, I think the consensus in physics is it's infinite. I don't think there's any number on it.
Well, yeah, and the number is, there's no hard number. I would agree that yeah, who knows?
Well, I mean, I think that most of the different theories of cosmology and the size of the universe is that literally infinite, given general and special relativity and Alan Guth's early universe inflation. The size of the universe is infinite, literally. So,
well, there's the problem of actual infinities.
No, there's not. That's not a problem in physics. That's a philosophical thing.
It is philosophical. I mean, when you make a distinction and say the universe is infinite, you're actually saying that there is such a thing as a physical infinity.
Yep,
and we've not seen that.
We don't need to, again. So that's just in physics.
I mean, if we're talking about hard science, we're talking about hard empirical science. To say that there's an actual infinity requires empirical evidence. If not, it's in the realm of imagination.
Well, no. So science, you don't need to see everything in the theory. You just need to make a testable prediction. For example, predicting fossils and evolution.
Physical materialism, then, is it?
No, it still is. So for example, in evolution, we don't predict the position of every single fossil in the historical record. We predict a certain kind of fossil, and then if we discover that one fossil, we can count that as a confirmation of the entire theory. So the physics theories make predictions like the cosmic microwave background, the curvature of space-time, the bending of black holes. All of those are confirmed. So those are all evidence that the universe is infinite because it's based off of those models, just like finding one fossil is evidence of the entire theory of evolution. And so you don't actually need to demonstrate the actual infinity of space. You just need to make testable predictions. So we do have evidence of those.
No one has actually shown an actual infinity. So you don't need to. You can predict one, but one doesn't actually exist that we know of in empirical science. You don't have that data.
You don't need to. Again, that's not a thing.
Well, I think that's special pleading to say that I'm going to be an empiricist. I'm going to be a methodological naturalist. I'm going to be a philosophical naturalist. But I can say that when it comes to the physicality of an infinite universe, I don't need evidence for that.
No, we have evidence for that. So no one's actually demonstrated the Big Bang exists, but we do have lots of evidence of the Big Bang.
Well, okay, so take the cosmic microwave background radiation. Are you familiar with the problem of the axis of evil within that radiation?
Yeah, the fact that there's a difference in heat from one side to the other, which again isn't really an issue.
Well, it kind of is, because there's the quadrupole and the octupole and the monopole. So you know what those are?
The different sections of the space that's being measured from where we look.
Right. So you had the Wilkinson microwave background radiation antenna, and then you had the Planck satellite before that. They both came to the same conclusion about this data. And for the sake of the listeners, I'm not saying you don't know this, but maybe you already do. But the quadrupole, so they divided up this sort of egg-shaped sphere of the universe, the picture of the cosmic microwave background.
Yeah, the stuff above us is slightly less temperature-wise than the stuff below us. And so
so there's the monopole, and then there's the quadrupole, where you have fourths. You have this fourth, that, this, and that. So that oval is divided up into fourths, and all of those temperatures seem to fit together. Then when you divide it into eighths, the same pattern emerges. And what it appears to be, and I'm not saying that this is what the data ultimately concludes, but it does look like, to the physicist, I was watching a video and reading a book by an Ohio State astrophysicist who seems to think that this possibly looks like the Earth, or at least the Milky Way, is central to the universe, the way the monopole, the quadrupole, and the octupole line up. And that was not something that Alan Guth or any inflationary theory had predicted. It was something that came back from the two data receivers. And so, you know, I think science has a wonderful wonderful ability to predict things. But here's the question, Tom. Why is the universe and nature in itself so regular that we can make these accurate predictions? It's not science that's fundamentally doing this. This is not a fundamental quality of science, but a fundamental quality of the universe, that the universe can be predictable. This is what Einstein means by the intelligibility that just seems, if in a random universe that just kind of pops into existence, you wouldn't have predicted a universe that has so much regularity and predictability.
Yes, you would. Like, I mean, that's fundamentally false. Like everyone.
We don't know for sure, but it doesn't seem to me on naturalism that you would be able to predict a universe that would be so as regular as ours.
Actually, we do. We predict that all the time. Again, that's consensus in cosmology and physics, is that, yeah, they would be.
Prediction, the ability to predict is within nature itself. It's regularity.
Yeah, that's the consensus in physics. So
Yeah,
for any unknown, again, what you just presented was a God of the gaps. You said, here's something we can't explain. I can make up an explanation that is God. I mean, we can just make up an explanation that is natural. I can say there's an undiscovered law that does that.
I'm not God of the gap in here. Here's what I'm doing. I'm saying that with the if you look at our conversation as a cumulative case evidence that I presented in, I can't talk about every aspect of this, excuse me, but for the God of the gaps, here's an argument. I can say, why is there coffee on the table? Now I can explain how a French press works. I can explain how to boil water. I can explain how an espresso machine works with the electricity and how all the machinery works. And that's a perfectly legitimate explanation. So I could take apart the coffee machine and explain that. That's a perfectly legitimate explanation. There's also a very personal reason why there's coffee. And so for me, I can say, why is there coffee? Well, I made it. That's a personal explanation. Now, me saying that I made it does not cancel out the explanation that is afforded by the machinery. If you took the coffee part apart, or if you took apart, physics, the physics of heat and conductivity and water boiling and all that kind of stuff, those explanations are not mutually exclusive. I'm not substituting, we don't know the method, therefore me. I'm saying that even if we did know the method, me is still a legitimate explanation, though it does not, I grant, have the details that a physical explanation of taking apart the coffee pot would.
Right, so right, but that is exactly the God of the gaps argument. So, for example, it's John Lennox's argument. I know is one about the cake and saying, well, why is the cake on the table? And you can do all the chemical calculations. But so if we explain why is the universe the way it is, it could be explained by a being with personal agency, or it could be explained by an impersonal force of nature with no being. And those are mutually exclusive. So those, you can always say, well, maybe I can explain this this force as being done by a being. Like, that's just an infinite regress, unfalsifiable claim. You could say that about anything. I could say the personal being is explained by an unexplained force, and you can go back infinite regress to doing that the whole time. But the truth is that it could be explained by just a force with no being at all, and that would be mutually exclusive. And that those two alternatives can make different predictions. Since they can both be explained, they explain the evidence, we would go with whichever one makes the testable predictions. And the science is the ones that do that, not the theistic being one. Even though you can insert that before the science for anything, you can do the same for any other assertion as well. That isn't actually evidence that it's true. So the question is why should we believe that isn't an imaginary explanation? And all of the things we have it probably is just an imaginary explanation. All of the evidence we have in physics, the consensus in every field of physics, in every field of cosmology, in every field of science is that, no, that's just natural laws. There is no being there, even though you could insert one.
Now laws, you bring up laws, this gets us back into mathematics. They're descriptive. Laws are not causal, Tom, would you agree?
Laws describe something that exists in the world.
Right.
The thing that exists.
They can't cause and they can't govern.
No, the things that exist in the world do cause and govern. We just call them laws.
What is the cause and the governance going on there? What's the actual source of this governance? If it's not the laws, I think we'd agree the laws are descriptions. Right. They're not causal agents. So for you, what is the ultimate causal agency of the universe? Energy
and motion.
What do you mean by energy and motion? Because if we talk about energy, which is, you talk about pure energy like photons, no mass? Or are you talking about energy within a planet? Are you talking about energy with mass? Are you talking about pure photon energy?
All of that energy. That's all energy. That's all E = mc squared. Energy is the fundamental nature of reality.
I don't know sometimes what people mean by energy. Some people think energy is eternal. Do you ascribe to that view?
Yes.
Okay, in light of the second law of thermodynamics, how do you justify energy being eternal?
The second law of thermodynamics doesn't say energy is not eternal. In fact, the first law of thermodynamics says it is actually eternal. So
no, it doesn't say eternal.
Actually, it does. I mean, I apologize to interrupt, but yes, the consensus in every physics and cosmology is that energy is eternal. If just quoting Sean Carroll, he spent 30 minutes online, found 17 models of eternal cosmology where energy is eternal. His specific model of the bouncing is where entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, has a collapse at a single point, and then it expands again in the past. So the second law of thermodynamics doesn't in any way say energy isn't eternal. It's not at all what it says. It just says there is a beginning to the inflation, and that's it.
Yeah, so that what you said came out of the debate with Bill Craig in 2014 at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, where they were debating cosmology, and a lot of people think Bill lost that debate. Well, but Sean is that quip you refer to is here in the it's on page 46. And it's in the Q&A, and those are the 7. He went online in about a half an hour. He found
actually, I think that was in his rebuttal, not the Q&A.
It might have been in his rebuttal. Anyway, he found 17 different models, and he says this. He says, so the question is, are there realistic models of eternal cosmologies? He says, I spent a half hour on the internet, and I was able to come up with about 17 different plausible-looking models of eternal cosmologies. I do not claim that any of these is the right answer. We're nowhere near the right answer yet, and you can come up with objections to every one of these models, but you cannot say that they are not eternal. And he ends with an exclamation point. And so, Tom, I would ask, if I had the opportunity, I would ask Sean Carroll.
One second, ends with an exclamation point in the middle of a debate. Like he adds the exclamation point with his finger.
Right. So I guess I have to go back and watch and see if that's what he was, if that was warranted there, of course. But anyway, so I'd ask you, if I'd ask Sean the same thing, what do you mean by eternal?
Exists at an infinite past. There is a negative infinity for the past.
So is it for you a series of successive
in the A theory of time? Yes, that is an infinite successive period.
Okay, so for me, I understand eternal to be timeless and spaceless.
Yeah, so that would be another alternative. That would be more like a B theory of time or a C theory of time, where it's like there's a iteration device. But
right.
All of those are possibilities.
Yeah, so when we're trading in this idea of eternality, and I'm not saying you're doing this, what I hear a lot is that people will use this substitute. They will take energy, they will posit it as eternal, and that word elicits in the mind of a believer like myself, oh, well, you're talking about you're basically replacing the eternality of God with the eternality of energy. But God is not a successive series of events into the infinite past, and he's not a successive series of events into the future. So we're talking about two different things when it comes to eternity there.
Oh, right. So I actually use both of those definitions in different contexts. In these contexts of the models Sean Carroll is using, they are a past infinite, a successive series of events, one after the other, that is a past infinite. I do also use eternal to mean the other thing, where there is a particle that exists outside of space-time, such as the emergent space-time from Nima Arkani Hamad from the amplituhedron. So there are also those kinds of models, but in the case of the one Sean Carroll is mentioning, they're all past eternal successive series of events.
And would you agree that we do not have access to these past successive series?
Right. We don't have access to the Big Bang either, but that's not relevant.
Yeah. Okay. So that I'm just scientifically, that's why cosmology is largely theoretical, because you're postulating things that exist beyond our ability to perceive. Correct. So,
well, sort of. So there's one caveat I would say to that, is that everything in physics and cosmology is only allowed to use verified principles, particles, and laws in physics, and you can have to just combine them in different novel ways. So those are more supported than any theistic model in philosophy, because those are adding in things we don't have verified principles for, like different properties of omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipotence, whatever. Those properties don't have a basis in reality, whereas every single property in every one of the cosmological models do. They're all verified principles, particles, and laws. They're just combined in new ways.
So what would you would agree, though, that the postulation of things, so you can take, like Alan Guth's inflation there's 1,000 variables on that theme about what started inflation. Did it come before or after the Big Bang? What started it? What stopped it? What caused it? What was the size of the universe? And all of these kinds of things. So there's a great deal of variety about inflationary models, because we're dealing in the theoretical and the abstract. It doesn't demonstrate that energy has a past series of infinite existences beyond our universe. That is something that is, in your view, Tom, would that be something that is part of reality or part of an imagined reality?
Well, Guth's inflation doesn't say anything about it past. It's not the point. It's just saying, it's making a prediction.
Lord Guth Vilenkin stops the infinite regress in terms of
No,
a
it doesn't
universe.
actually. That was in
Well,
the Sean Carroll debate where
in
Guth actually said,
its
yes,
state
it
of
is
expansion,
probably
well, in its state of expansion is what the BVG says,
right.
right? So
The
that
expansion. The expansion had a
right. So
beginning.
our universe BVG, if we're taking that, it has not been disputed. It was 2006. Our universe is in a state of expansion that's greater than zero.
Right.
So our universe has a past time incomplete boundary, which rules out it actually coming from an infinite series
No,
of
that's the part that's false. That nowhere in the BVG does it say that. It says the inflation has a finite beginning and the inflation has a beginning, but that's it. It does not say time, does not say space, does not say energy, does anywhere in the theory. And Sean Carroll actually showed a picture of Alan Guth saying exactly that, which was hilarious, in that debate that you mentioned. So,
and yeah, so why is there widespread disagreement about this? Because we're
well, there's
dealing
not. The consensus in physics is exactly what I said. Like, there's only a small minority of people who take that to mean that it had an absolute beginning, and it's usually the theists. I know Blinken isn't a theist, and there's a few others that don't, but the vast majority of the consensus is it's past eternal.
so you would go with a scientific consensus about the nature of reality.
I would go with the scientific consensus of physics about the physics nature of reality. Yes.
Do physicists like Carroll use words to describe the nature of reality that we cannot see?
No, they use mathematical models.
That's a language, right?
Yes. So,
So
so, so
they're using a language that they've created to describe things they cannot see. Is that correct?
no, again, so they're using a language which they're only allowed to use principles, particles, and laws that have been verified. So they're only allowed to use language words that represent things we know exist in reality. So they're not allowed to use anything else.
But they've made up the language.
The language is just the random words we use to describe things that exist in reality. So it's the things that exist in reality are the only things they're allowed to use, and they make different combinations of those things, and they use the words to represent them.
For you, does language exist in reality?
It exists in our minds, which exist in reality.
So language does exist in reality.
In abstractly, yes.
So, but we've made up the language, correct?
Yes, the language doesn't matter to anything I said in the argument.
Okay, so how do we know, how would we, using language, whether it's math or English or it's, Arabic, whatever, using math and language, how do we ever know that we are beyond our descriptions, we going beyond our descriptions and actually are accurately describing reality and not just making something up?
Novel testable predictions, that's what science does.
Okay, right. So what I'm getting at is, how do you have novel testable predictions about things in the past that we're trying to describe using language that is subjective, theoretical, and made up?
Again, the language subjectivity is irrelevant. You can just call it X, you get the same result. So nothing about the language matters. You can change the language any way you want, you get the same result. The way we know it is novel testable predictions. We could say Alan Guth's early universe inflation theory made a prediction about the cosmic microwave background, which was confirmed, which is why it's an accepted theory. It happened billions of years ago, like I think it was 300,000 years after the Big Bang or whatever. But the reason we know it's true is because it made a prediction that we didn't know yet. We confirmed the prediction, which gives us a reason to believe that it's true about the past. That's why we can infer things from the past, is because we can make future predictions. And if those future predictions are confirmed, then the theory is justified.
Mm-hmm. And have you ever read Thomas Kuhn or
Yes.
Michael Polanyi?
Yes. What is it? I forget what Kuhn's big work was, but yes.
The Nature of Scientific Revolutions.
Yeah.
Where he uses very specific religious language to talk about the shift in scientific paradigms.
That's it.
So,
paradigm shift. That's the one.
Yeah. So he uses religious language to talk about, the shift from a Newtonian worldview, and then you're converted to an Einstein worldview, and he talks about these paradigmatic shifts in cosmology and science, not just in cosmology, but in science. So science seems to be an ever-shifting.
Sorry, got to interrupt. It's almost, you said you had to go at 1?
I do have to wrap up. It's 12. I've got to be in Arlington in a minute.
Yeah. This is I want to keep going because this part's the really interesting part. We got to talk about this again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to do it if we want to arrange another time. I've enjoyed my time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely want to go into the past infinites and talk more about those and why they're not a problem, and definitely the scientific method and why testable predictions can give us information from the past. It's so interesting to talk about.
And I think the God of the universe, the risen Lord Jesus Christ, is, of course, I know you don't agree, but that is, when he said, "Let there be light," he wasn't kidding.
Well, light didn't come until like 300,000 years after.
Yeah,
So
we can talk about that too. But I think it's been great, Tom. I've really enjoyed it. It's been I was a little nervous because but it was funny. You pulled up Carol and I had the book right here. That's really cool.
Yeah,
So I've really enjoyed it, and maybe we can schedule a time to continue. Thank you.
definitely. Really enjoyed it. Love talking to you, and I'll let you get to your appointment. Talk to you
Thank you,
later.
Tom. And is this going to be on your channel, or
Yeah,
is it
it's already
already?
there. There's lots of comments.
Oh, okay. So you're not going to edit or anything, or
No, I'm way too lazy for that.
okay? You're like me. I got to edit podcasts. I'm like, oh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, editing is hard. All right, Tom. Thank you so much for your cordiality and good discussion. Thank
Yep.
you.